We have a very interesting saga. It takes me a while to explain, so why don't we just start the show? Welcome in. This is most likely Monday, July 21st. How do I know that? Well, if you're watching it on Monday, July 21st, you know that. But I recorded this show a week or so ago. I had to take a little day off today. And I like these programs, as you know, when we get a chance to kind of spread our wings a little bit. We call them evergreen programs. They are without our rundown, where we bang out 5 or 6 or 7 issues of the day, but it gives us a longer time to explore interesting subject matter with our guests. And so this show tonight is about, so this is a show where you're just going to sit back, listen at your leisure, and I'm obliged if you do, and just kind of get a flavor for a local journalist here who is working almost like a life mission project and has been held up in kind of an extraordinary way. I'm going to actually let him kind of drive the show and tell the story. Phil Isle is with us from the Providence Phoenix. Here is the guy he's writing about. It's simple as it. This is the doctor that is the central focus of Phil's work. Well, let's get into it here. We've got all sorts of ditties and headlines and things to show you, but we hinted about this project. Welcome, by the way.
Thanks for
We
having me
hinted
back.
about this project last time that you were on, and I said, you know what, we need a whole show for that is what you're working on. That's Dr. Volkman right
That's
there, right? Who is he?
Paul Volkman is a guy who is currently spending 4 consecutive life terms in federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, for prescription drug dealing with death or injury resulting. My connection to his story is that he went to college at the University of Rochester and an MD PhD program, essentially medical school, at the University of Chicago. He did both of those with my father, who's a local physician.
Yeah, you got to put those pictures up. This is kind of a funny. Just the old days, everybody wore the same glasses. The guy on the left is your dad.
That's right.
Who has since passed, correct?
No, he's here.
No, he's still.
He's around.
Why did I think that? Did I? Well, there's a lot of people who passed
Still
in this story.
He's still practicing endocrinology in Fall River.
All right, good. Well, sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to do that. There's mistake number 1. But on the guy right side is Dr. Volkman, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, those two guys look strangely alike, don't they?
Well, yeah. I mean, the eeriness of the similarities and, of course, vast differences was something that really drove my interest in the story.
Okay. So once upon a time, you found out. Tell me how this whole thing came together.
Once upon a time, I guess it's like 5 years ago now, I was a young journalist who was about to go off to a graduate program in writing. I was a guy who had been heavily inspired by books like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, you know, the famous true crime book. And just as I was about to enter this 2-year writing program in New York, I had other plans for the things I was going to do there. I learned about this former classmate of my father's who had been indicted by the federal government for on numerous counts of prescription drug dealing under the guise of chronic pain management, with many, many deaths of his patients as a result, according to their indictment. My father had been out of touch with this guy for decades. They really had fallen out of touch in the 70s after they graduated from the University of Chicago, and it wasn't until Paul, Dr. Volkman's wife, passed away.
Dad too passed away.
Yeah.
In all my notes. Okay, good.
That he called up my parents, as he did a few other of his old classmates, out of the blue in, I think it was 2008 or 9, to ask them to come to Chicago to her funeral. My parents hadn't heard from him. My dad hadn't heard from him in a long time. When they went, they of course went to the funeral, but another friend of theirs had just Googled his name. This other friend had been invited to come to the funeral, and in Googling his name, as you know people do for people they haven't seen in a while, you know, an article came up, Moore died as 3-year probe unfolded, from the Columbus Dispatch, detailing, you know, how far off the beaten path this guy had gone. And
now help me, was he going to be at the funeral?
Dr. Volkman was at the funeral.
Okay.
He had been indicted and arrested and briefly incarcerated.
So this is kind of a neat thing. I mean, I'm glad your dad's alive, and it seems to me he's probably a good guy. He hadn't seen his old college pal in that long a period of time and is asked to come out to the funeral. Most people would say, hey, listen, I'll send some flowers. Or why did your dad go? Why did your parents go?
I asked him that. I got the chance to interview my dad a couple times on the record with the tape recorder there at the home kitchen table.
How's that like? What's that like?
Well, I mean, a huge part of this story was digging into who my dad is and was. I mean, I learned many, many things about him that I didn't know. I've known him as a guy in private practice, as a practicing endocrinologist pretty much my whole life. Via this project, I learned that he was really trained, like Dr. Volkman was, to be a medical researcher, to be a guy in a lab, not necessarily seeing patients all the time, but writing papers and pushing forward, medical knowledge. The way doctors learn about the cutting edge of what's happening is by papers other doctors write. They went to something called the MSTP, Medical Scientist Training Program, which was federally funded at the University of Chicago. And there's an irony or a circle somewhere in the fact that the federal government paid to educate Dr. Volkman to a very high level with a PhD in pharmacology, the study of prescription drugs. And ultimately, it was the federal government that would investigate, prosecute, convict, and now incarcerate the guy.
All right, so you learn about that through the conversations you had with your dad and
Right.
research. They go out to the funeral, and this kind of inspires you. The whole thing is inspiring you. They've learned as they go out that this guy's jammed up.
Right, they go out and they come back, and just in kind of a normal conversation, they mention it to me. Here I am, I'm writing for the Providence Phoenix, writing for the Jewish Voice and Herald. I'm going off to graduate school. I want to be a writer. I want to tell nonfiction stories. And it was a, whoa.
Were they nonplussed about it, or were they shocked about it?
Oh, they were shocked about it.
Okay.
But there wasn't much that they did. Paul, when they went out to Chicago, where he was living in, I'd say, much reduced circumstances from where he once was living. He was living at once upon a time on Lakeshore Drive, which, as anyone who's been to Chicago knows,
Nice
is
spot.
Park Avenue type situation. At this time, he was living in a little apartment overlooking the interstate. So in this apartment, after the funeral, he had told them his side of the story, how he was wrongfully convicted, how this was an out-of-control government. He's super against the war on drugs. He felt he was caught up in over-aggressive, wrongful investigation, prosecution. My parents heard this, they kind of nodded, and then they kind of said goodbye and came back, and that was that.
And told you, and you went, wow, what a story.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so there you go. So we're going to pause here. We'll come back. So Phil says, wow, what a story, and then he goes out to research the story. And guess what? It has not been easy. That's an understatement, correct?
That's right.
Stay with us. So there's Phil Isle, our editor of the Providence Phoenix in Portsmouth, Ohio, at the beginning of this saga. Not that that's like a big tourist trap out there in Portsmouth, Ohio, right? That's,
Not so much.
That's a working person's town, no doubt about it, yes?
It was. It's on pretty hard times these days.
And that's where Dr. Volker was.
That was where Dr. Volkman set up a number of chronic pain management clinics, which were later deemed by a jury to be drug dealing operations.
Okay, so if you've missed the first segment, these shows are always available online after you see them. We're talking about Phil's effort to chronicle a story that he came into touch with when his parents returned home from a funeral visit for the deceased wife of a long time ago college friend who ends up, they find out, he's ended up jammed up on multiple counts of homicide, right? Correct?
He wasn't charged with homicide, but they were alleging that the cocktail of drugs he prescribed, opiates, muscle relaxants, anti-anxiety medications, the volume was such that a number of his patients died as a result. And the key part of the indictment was they said these were essentially extra medical prescriptions.
Were there civil litigations that preceded this or post these federal charges?
There was one, I don't remember the exact timeline, one parent of a patient who passed away of Dr. Volkman's filed a wrongful death complaint. I think it was after the indictment.
How many people died over what period of time?
I would have to go back. I think it was something, listed in the indictment was something like 18 patients. I believe that was over a 2 or 3 year time period. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but I got into what I soon learned when I dove into the project was a highly politicized subject of, I mean, you name it, chronic pain management, opiates, pills like oxycodone, which is what's in OxyContin, and to people on one side of the story, that's of course, throw this guy away, he killed 18 people. To people who are sympathetic to doctors like Dr. Volkman, and I met these people, pain patients' rights activists, for example, they would say that the people who are in chronic pain clinics in the first place are there because they are terminally desperately ill and they are liable to die. And these people would argue that prosecutors in their zeal to go after supposed drug dealers are just kind of lumping sick people who died into an indictment. Do I believe that? Therein lies the intrigue of what I was interested in figuring out. Is this guy a good guy or a bad guy?
Okay, so as you chronicle this, it's not been easy. Tell us about the problems that you've had in trying to do your documentation and all of that.
Well, so when I learned about this, the first thing I did was send Dr. Volkman a letter, which he responded. I basically said, hey, this is who I am. I heard about your story. I want to write about it. Can I come interview you? And he agreed. He gave me a call, and in the December of 2009, I went out to Chicago and interviewed him at length for over a few different days. And we did that a few more times the next summer, and then we kind of had a little bit of a falling out, and then...
Why?
It was always tense. This is a guy who is not an easy guy to get along with. Not that I was interested in being his friend. He at one point just said, I'm kind of done talking to you. I've said enough. Later on, when we began corresponding again in prison, he said, you know what, I've changed my mind. I talked to somebody else whom you interviewed, and you made a favorable impression on this guy who I respect, so I'm going to keep talking to you.
Was he erratic?
Yeah.
From the stress of the prosecution, or instinctively as part of his chemical makeup?
Both. It was tough for me to get a read on who this guy was when he was doing what he was doing, because I met him after he had already been indicted and had his assets frozen and been incarcerated and had his wife die and had his wife be really sick with brain cancer while he was locked away.
So you interviewed him pre-trial, though?
Yep.
And then he was convicted, correct?
Yep.
And he's doing life? What's he doing?
Life, 4 consecutive life terms, plus some additional smaller sentences, as if those matter, in federal prison.
And so you have, as you go out and you visit with him, and then you do your other research, you've been jammed up a lot.
So I do, yeah, I do all kinds of research to condense a lot of time and a lot of hours and a lot of driving. And I interviewed pain experts. I went to the town where he was practicing or dealing drugs, depending on who you believe, repeatedly. I went all over the place. I interviewed family members. I went to Wisconsin, Kentucky, North Carolina, Florida, Dartmouth University, UPenn, all over the place, and was picking up a lot of steam. And what I eventually realized I wanted to be a book. And then when it came time to get the material from his trial, he had a 9-week trial in the spring of 2011, which was going to be key to telling the story. He was convicted, but I wanted to see the evidence, as would the readers of this book, as would, I think, anyone who cares about what happens when the federal government puts away somebody for 4 life terms. Let's see what he did. Well, you can get the transcripts from the trial, but I can't get the evidence, which I ultimately learned via a Freedom of Information Act request is over 15,000 pages of material. So that's where I am right now. I mean, that FOIA request was filed.
Why can't you get the evidence?
I haven't really gotten a satisfactory answer.
Is there a federal protocol on trials like this that is consistent across the board?
I haven't really figured that out. I went to the clerk. I appealed to the judge. I did all the things that you would do kind of instinctually to get evidence after a trial occurs, and was said no.
Have you filed a formal judicial action trying to get those things released?
Like a lawsuit, like a FOIA complaint?
Right.
No. Now we get into stuff where now, however many years after I first started the project, I have a full-time job which keeps me plenty busy, which I love. This newsletter of the Providence Phoenix, weekly publication, it never sleeps. And I, can't, for example, I don't have the time or mental energy, I think, to go back into this and file a lawsuit, which I intend to do at some point. Maybe that's a cop-out, but I don't have the bandwidth to edit the Phoenix and go full steam ahead on
So the
this.
moral of the story, in part, is that you're into this for time, money, energy, and you feel stalled. Correct? This guy's life story,
Sure.
you think should be told and let people determine whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, but you can't get there from here yet.
I can explain this from any number of angles. I don't want to say a woe is me story. People died here, right? I mean, I'm certainly keeping this into perspective. And there are other people who had serious chronic pain, and there's a guy in prison. So I am not in the worst position of anyone here. But that said, I deeply believe this is a story that should be told. I went into the bookstore recently, at Brown Bookstore, as I often do, went to the true crime section, stacks of books, and I didn't see a true crime book in there, and obviously not all of them, about prescription drugs. And to me, given all the stories and the news that's happened in this country in the last decade, where is that book? This, for me, was going to be that book. I think it still can be that book. Maybe it's overstated. I believe this could be the definitive prescription drug true crime story because I saw so much, but I also have so much that I don't have in hand right now.
I don't even know what the solution is. We'll talk about whether this, what Phil's instinct is as to whether this guy is a good guy or a bad guy when we come back. Yeah, I mean, there's just another headline in the Providence Phoenix where Phil Isle works and edits. We've had an incredible statistical bad run here in Southern New England and Rhode Island for overdoses from prescription drugs, which is the basis. Again, we're talking about a story that Phil is working on, and if you followed it from the beginning, you know that he has been, he's been writing a book on this Dr. Volkman out of Ohio who went to school with his dad. And there's an old sign of one of his pain management offices out there in Ohio, right?
Yeah, that was in my travels. I went to one of his former offices, and it was pretty picturesque there, the faded letters from his sign.
So this guy's doing multiple concurrent life sentences, consecutive life sentences on charges and guilty verdicts on drug overdosing, and you've got a story that. Are you a quarter written, a half written, 3/4 written? Do you know where you are in the research on this whole thing to write the book, the definitive true crime book on the
prescription
overdose?
drugs in America? I don't know what the fraction is. The image I think of is a donut. I have so much of the secondary and tertiary information, but the centerpiece, you asked me before the show started, is this guy a good guy or a bad guy? The verdict's in, but that's not enough for me.
Well, the verdict is the context of the judicial system, which is not a perfect system.
Of course, and to me, the evidence that showed, I mean, in another kind of true crime story, there's a violent crime scene with bullet casings or a bloody knife. In this case, it's paperwork, it's medical records, it's autopsy reports, it's blurry. And the whole field of pain management and addiction are incredibly blurry, and that's what fascinated me.
So the transcripts of the case, which you have,
yeah,
don't tell you enough about the travel of this case and whether something fishy went on or whether
they tell a lot. They tell everything that was said in the courtroom, which is critical.
Okay.
But when I learned that there are 15,000 pages of material of evidence showing the way the government told the story to the jury, I can't, as a writer, I would go crazy.
You couldn't rely on the transcript as the basis of truth. You've got to be able to decipher for yourself what the evidence was and how it was presented. Correct?
That would be ideal.
All right. So
yeah.
Anybody who's watched this entire conversation
Yeah.
and has a reasonable, objective mind is going. And I want to say this as respectfully as I can.
Don't sugarcoat it.
Why are you crying in your milk here? Like you got a great story.
Yeah.
You've got a mission not only to verify whether this guy's trial and verdict is accurate, but there's a bigger story on this unfortunate wave of prescription drug medicine.
Yeah.
So just do it.
Well, I have a job. I have a day job.
Right.
Which I like and which is highly demanding. And I would say to those people, listen, I'm with you. Of all it's not like I just rolled over. I spent hundreds of hours thousands of dollars. I drove zigzagged across.
But are you blaming anybody for stopping? So in other words, the DEA was more.
Yeah,
you're mad at the DEA.
There has been incredible.
You could have done the work if you got the cooperation on the evidence, is what you're saying.
Yes. First, I made the FOIA request to the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys in D.C. They sat on it for 9 months with a lot of calls by me saying, it's coming, it's coming. At one point, someone said, I have the box, it's ready to go. And then they said, well, looks like we don't have the jurisdiction, we're going to send it over to the DEA, who has just been, I figured out the rate at which they're dispensing.
And why do you think they're so slow? Short answer.
I don't know. I wish I knew. Could be incompetence. It could be deliberately stonewalling me.
If the feds were more cooperative, the book would get going and you'd finish it. So the moral of the story is, we got to know why the feds are so slow.
Yes.
And you don't have that answer.
I did the math before I came here. At the rate they're doing my request, it would take 15 years to fulfill my request. That can't be the way the system is designed to work. The citizens of the United States put this guy away. They paid for his prosecution, and they're paying for him in jail. I don't want to live in a society, I'm not exonerating the guy, but I don't want to live in a country where we put people away for 4 life terms and we don't see the evidence.
All right. So as you progress, come back and tell us how you're doing.
I'll be back as many times as you'll have me back.
Phil Isle, the editor of the Providence Phoenix. Final word and we can back to it. That was an interesting story. I think we're going to get a second or third or fourth chapter from Phil. If you've got an interesting story that you want us to tell and we're kind of in the mood to spread it out a little bit, that's how you get in touch with us. Call, email, Facebook post, whatever it happens to be. All right, another Monday summer night is in the books. It goes too fast, doesn't it? We'll be back here tomorrow at 7:30 and 11:30, and of course on the radio tomorrow at noon on WPRO. Have a great night.